Before we get started in this episode of Lab Out Loud, we'd like to thank our Patreons, all the patrons at Patreon who have supported the show by making a contribution or a pledge to our show. And we'd like to give a shout out to our latest Patreon supporter, Catherine Prammer.
If you would like to find out how you can support us through Patreon, head on over to laboutloud.com.
That's right, and there you'll see the Patreon logo where you can sign up and help us celebrate the joys of teaching science. Support for Lab Out Loud is brought to you by the National Science Teachers Association. Find out more at nsta.org. You're listening to Lab Out Loud, Science for the Classroom and beyond. And today we're talking about what happens when we look to offer our students place-based education.
It does shift the role of the teacher. You now start to think of yourself as a community worker, not only the master of your subject content. You start to think of yourself as someone who necessarily has to build relationships in order to bring the knowledge and expertise and strengths into the classroom.
That's up next on Lab Out Loud, but first, I'm your co-host Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartel.
And today's episode starts off a 3-part series on the topic of place-based education, which is something that Brian was introduced to.
Well, some of you might remember me talking about Greg Smith on the podcast before because he started another podcast and talked about some educational policy things there.
My name's Greg Smith. I am a retired education professor from Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. Been retired for about a year, and before that time was very active in writing and studying place and community-based education, and am still involved working on the advisory committee for the Teton Science Schools and the school board of a small charter school that focuses on place-based education in Portland. So I'm trying to keep my hand in the mix.
Last year, I did a professional development opportunity where the topic was place-based education, and it's something that was kind of foreign to me, but when we went through the class, I absolutely noted that there can be a strong component for science in place-based education, as in many other things, too.
The overall emphasis in place-based education is trying to bring in more local knowledge and issues and experiences into kids' school experiences. So that they have an opportunity to link what's happening in the classroom to their own lives. And it really cuts across the entire curriculum. It can deal with natural resource issues, it can deal with cultural issues, historical issues. But the aim is to really try to break down the walls between school and community. And the aim for doing this is just to engage students more than oftentimes is the case in most classrooms. Give them an opportunity to experience what it means to be an involved citizen by kind of looking at community issues and trying to take action with regard to them. Giving them the opportunity to act as environmental stewards, and finally to begin to take on the role of leader in terms of problem solving and really being involved in the community itself. I think one of the hopes is that students who have done place-based education will really be better able to be contributors to the health and welfare of both the social and natural environments in which they live.
Joining us in the show also is Ethan Lowenstein.
I'm a professor of teacher education at Eastern Michigan University, and I'm also the director of a program called the Southeast Michigan Stewardship Coalition, and we work with teachers and community educators in Southeast Michigan in how to use a place-based learning approach. And just building on what Greg is saying, when we talk about place-based education in the Southeast Michigan Stewardship Coalition, we usually say that it has to have at least 3 components. It has to involve student-driven inquiry. In other words, young people need to be immersed in their communities, and they need to be immersed in phenomena. Those phenomena raise questions and curiosity, and then the teacher needs to serve in the role of guide on the side and taking those questions and running with those questions as a class, which is pretty complex teaching. The second thing that needs to happen in place-based education is the young person needs to feel that they're connected to their place, to their communities. And in our culture right now, in many communities, young people, everybody feels rather disconnected from the webs of relationships in their communities, both the webs of relationships with human to human and also with with the plants and the animals and the ecosystem. So that connection to place is especially crucial in communities that are getting messages from the media, from dominant society, that their communities are not worth anything. Uh-huh. So if you're a child living in a say an urban community or rural community where you're getting the message that your community is worthless, you're going to internalize those messages. So what place-based education does is say, well, let's look at the strengths in our community. Let's look at the wisdom in our community. Let's connect with neighbors, because in every community there exists tremendous amounts of wisdom of how to live more sustainably and how to live more ethically with each other. So as opposed to, say, problem-based learning, I would say place-based education also really stresses observation, long-term relationship building, and also looking at strengths and focusing on strengths in order to address those problems. And then the third piece that Greg mentioned was civic engagement. And I think that it's very easy to look at problems, and the problems that we're facing right now as a society, social and ecological problems, are very complex problems. And so it's easy to become disheartened as a young person. And if you learn about just the problems and you're not empowered to take action, and when I say empowered, I mean actually empowered. And I think oftentimes we kind of dumb down civic education. You know, you read a letter to your senator and so on, or you're told, you don't need to know this now, you can't vote. So what place-based education does is it allows for young people to make a choice in the present about the society that they want, the community that they want, and helps and gives young people the actual tools to engage with their community and engage in that public space.
Do either of you have an example that might also be a science classroom scenario?
Sure. I learned about a program in southeastern Idaho a number of years ago that was started by a guy named Mike Winston, who had been a contractor before he came back to the classroom. And he began his career as a teacher by asking people in the community what hoped high school graduates would demonstrate. And folks said that they really hoped people would be good problem solvers, able to communicate, and work collaboratively on teams. And as Mike looked at the high school curriculum, he realized there wasn't a lot happening that really kind of addressed all three of those issues. So he decided to create a class that he called Science Solutions. And he would ask students at the beginning of the year in teams to identify issues that they were really interested in exploring and potentially addressing. And one year, a group of students decided that they were especially concerned about the declining population of Yellowstone cutthroat trout. And so they wanted to figure out, well, what was happening to these populations, and was there anything they could do? And they started out exploring the use of hatch boxes just to increase the survival rate of the young fish, but quickly realized that that was not really going to solve the problem. And as they furthered their investigations, they realized that what was really creating the diminished populations was the erosion of soil throughout the region, largely because of the fact that the native shortgrasses that had grown there for millennia were being replaced by invasives, and those invasives simply didn't hold the soil as well.
Sure. And
so they then began trying to figure out, well, what can we do about the invasives? And did some investigations and found out that there was a type of mohair goat that was particularly effective in eating these particular plants. So they got some goats and found out that indeed they loved those plants, and then began exploring like what might be done from an economic standpoint in terms of how it might be possible to kind of use products from those goats to create new economic possibilities in the region. And so I was really curious about this one time when I was giving a talk, and so I called Mike Winston and said, well, what happened with all of this? And he said, well, the students didn't really pursue the economic aspects of it, but they had created a small business using GIS equipment to be able to map the location of the invasives in the county. That they were able to then give to the one county worker who was assigned to their control. and that people had really caught on to the idea of using goats to control the invasives, and there were now 5,000 goats in the area that were being used to actually eat the invasives. And so those
using Goat PS to track them, right?
Goat PS.
Yeah. Well, who knows? As they do in Scotland, using sheep, I guess, on Shetland Island to kind of map the island. But a really positive thing, and I gave a talk in Idaho a few years ago and kind of mentioned this, and folks says, "Oh yeah, the weed guy." So it was really an impressive effort that had a real impact upon the broader community.
What was the time frame for this? I mean, teachers think in semesters and school years. This sounds like it went a little bit longer than that.
Well, I think it began as a one-semester project, as I recall.
Okay.
And then it really expanded to a much more ongoing effort. I know the last time I read about this, Mike was working at the middle school level, and students were catching local moths to use to control, I think, another invasive species that was having an impact on the Teton National Park. And so they kind of ranged into a variety of different areas, and it just took place in different ways in his own classes.
Mm-hmm. And I think you make a good point there, which is that a place-based experience can be anywhere from 2 weeks to a month to a semester to being a multi-year experience. And I think that when you talk about complex, interrelated social and ecological issues, it's unrealistic, right, that you're going to have significant impact in a short period of time. So part of what place-based education does is it provides a context for students to collaborate, for younger students to collaborate with older students, for students in 1 year to pick up a project that was started 3 years ago, and so it provides that continuity. So you're talking there again about sort of building community, and that's what scientists do, don't they? Mm-hmm. They don't take something and just do completely original work off the bat. They inherit, they build on knowledge, they construct new knowledge. So it's really getting them in the habit of understanding complex issues, appreciating those who have made contributions before, and then making their own contributions.
Ethan, you earlier talked about making a connection to your community and kind of focusing on the positive things and trying to make a positive change. Mm-hmm. What about, sometimes when you try to do an effort in your community, it fails or people don't listen. And how do you prepare, not isolate, but, I guess prepare students for facing that where it didn't work and they feel like, okay, that's it?
Yeah, so there's a good example of that where one of our teachers had this incredible project planned out where they were going to do a community garden, and the students had made presentations to the principal and gotten approval and so on. Mm-hmm. And it ended up that it just wasn't possible for whatever reason. Some barrier got in the way. And so, of course, the students were disheartened, and then the teacher said, this is what happens. And then they regrouped, they created another project. So I think part of what you're getting at there is extremely important, I think, which is you want to develop a culture of error in your classroom. And as a scientist, right, you learn from your errors. And so it's really important to focus on the ability to make errors, to observe, to reflect, to record what you're doing, to bring in additional perspectives and expertise to help you move around barriers that you face. And so I think oftentimes we sugarcoat experiences for youth. We don't immerse them in the real world of what happens when you're operating in a complicated social environment where you have to negotiate with real people, right? Yeah. And you have to, you're in real structures. And so I think that's actually just as important of a lesson there, a life lesson, and a lesson as a scientist as the success that you might have. And what you get are these incredibly resilient young people who will persevere through barriers that they face, and not get frustrated and give up after the first failure. So I think that's a really important thing. We want to, not only in science education, I think we just want our kids to grow up that way. I know I want my child to grow up that way.
Teaching them how to cope in essence.
Yeah.
We call that grit right now, right?
Yes.
But seriously though, you put it in a very eloquent way. we hear things like, failing forward. And of course that captures a sentiment in a nice package. But I think you eloquently said it better. Developing a culture of error within our classrooms definitely is important, not only for every other classroom, but especially in the science classroom. But it also makes me think about what our new standards are saying too about learning science and how we deal with that. Do you see alignment within the NGSS and as states have adapted their own like NGSS branded standards? Where would place-based education fall into that?
Greg, do you want to take that first, and then I could build on that?
Yeah. I'll be happy to. Yeah, I'd say that place-based education really offers an opportunity for students to learn in context, which is one of the central themes of the next generation science standards. It also provides many opportunities to actually apply in real life settings the kind of knowledge that students are gaining. I think that it also gives them an opportunity in many instances to work side by side with scientists themselves. I know there's some great examples from the project that Ethan's been involved with in Michigan, the Great Lakes Stewardship Initiative, up in northeastern Michigan. Students there have been doing really interesting population studies about rusty crayfish and zebra mussels, collecting data with local natural resource professionals who are out there kind of helping them learn how to collect the data, record it, and analyze it. And so they really have a chance to, not only kind of hear about science, they really have the chance to kind of act as scientists. And I think that also is like one of the central themes of the standards as I see them, that students are not supposed to act like science students. They're supposed to act like scientists. And I think that place-based education oftentimes gives them that kind of opportunity, which I think with regard to the aims of STEM education and really trying to attract more people to scientific professions, place-based education could really be a key to doing that.
And just building on what you're saying, Greg, also when you look at Appendix D of, for example, the next generation science standards, the research is really clear that when you're doing science and you're teaching science to students from what they call non-dominant groups, that could be in the document they talk about economically disadvantaged students, girls, students whose language is other than English. That the research is really clear that, and they even mention place-based education explicitly in the document, that this is a promising approach, and that what the document says is that place-based education respects students' funds of knowledge, their community knowledge that exists in their community and is culturally relevant. So, unless you're making, I think this is true of all students, of course, unless you're making the content relevant to the young person's life, then they're more likely to be engaged when you make that content relevant. And I think the other piece is that the NGSS really emphasizes systems thinking and complex relationships of cause and effect and so on. And so it's hard for me to imagine actually meeting the standards without doing something like place-based education, because in place-based education, you're taking that interdisciplinary approach, you're using different perspectives, you're not using a narrow approach. And the standards also are very clear that you have to discuss with your students that, for example, technology and science can't solve all our problems, right? Mm-hmm. In other words, you have to have those hard ethical discussions around. So when I think of it, I think of, we need to ask the question, why are we doing this? Why are we using science in this way? In what context are we using it, and for what purpose? Right? Why, in what context, for what purpose? Yeah. And if we're not answering those questions, then the young person is not going to be grounded with a sufficient rationale and motivation for doing science. And they're not going to be doing it, what I would say, in an ethical way that really, and a sophisticated way that really locates what they're doing within complex systems and their relationships.
What I'm also hearing is another way to put an end to a phrase that I cannot stand in school, which is in the real world.
Oh, yeah, I can't stand that either. I can't stand that either.
In the real world, well, first of all, they're students. learning is the real world. And now we can really say, like, we're literally trying to impact our community, our real world.
That's right. It's not a simulation. It's not a simulation. It's not something that we're constructing artificially. This is immersing young people in the relationships that they should be immersed in, but that they face lots of barriers to connecting with.
And I would say that what place-based education does is create opportunities for students to link what they're learning in school to their worlds. Like I was at a presentation a few weeks ago by a third-grade teacher at a school in Portland, and they had been investigating Pacific lampreys, which is an eel that migrates from inland out to the ocean and then back, and they're caught not too far from where I live at Willamette Falls. And some of the Pacific lamprey were actually brought into the classroom and kind of attached themselves to the kids' arms. And, it was just like this incredibly memorable experience, and it gave them an opportunity to learn about traditional Native American food and efforts to protect the lamprey. And so it was very directly related to their own place and to the history of that place and the cultures that exist here, and things that they could actually experience in a very dramatic way within the context of their own classrooms.
Yeah, another example from the Southeast Michigan Stewardship Coalition is we've had examples of schools in different parts of the region collaborating together on common problems. So we had two schools, one high school in Ypsilanti, Michigan, and Ypsilanti High School is mostly African American, and then we had elementary students from Summers Knoll, and that's a private school in Ann Arbor, which is mostly white, and we had, these are two communities that don't often collaborate together. The adults often don't collaborate together, and here we had a partner, We Are the Forest, who was working with both of the teachers, Jessica Kruger at Ypsilanti High School and Chris Winkle at Summers Knoll. And lo and behold, both groups of students had the same problem on their school grounds, that they were experiencing these intense rains, right? These climate change related rains that, it's coming down and flooding their fields. And so both of the schools' fields were flooded. And so Nate Ayers with We Are the Forest used a computer program software called iTree, in which young people went out onto their school grounds. They identified the shape of the land, where water flows. They looked at trees on their property and measured trees. They put it into the software program, and the software program called iTree spit out all kinds of data around the worth of the tree. And if they helped them actually design and model out solutions, so if you planted this kind of tree this distance from the school right here, it would save the school this amount of money in heating costs and cooling costs during the summer. It would take up this amount of water from the ground, and so on. And so what the students ended up doing at Ypsilanti High School was they ended up developing presentations using math. This was in a math class, and presenting their different models to the school's grounds crew of where to plant trees on the school property to prevent this flooding, and also to save energy at the school. And so the school grounds crew looked at these proposals. They chose the ones that were scientifically sound from their point of view, and then the students actually planted the trees that will last generations on those school grounds. So that's an example, I think, of something that is intensely relevant to a young person, and where they're seeing that they're contributing to community, not only for their generation, but for those who come after them.
What would you say to someone who tries to make the argument that maybe not all places are rich enough to pull this off? Maybe they say we don't
have a school forest.
Yeah, we're too rural. Our landscape is too dull, I guess. We don't have a lot of population around here. Something like that. We're not near any water.
I don't think true of southeastern Idaho. all of those factors: small, rural, limited location, limited amount of water, not a particularly dramatic environment. So I think every place, actually, one begins to look, has extraordinary riches. And so I think one of the challenges with place-based education is to really encourage teachers to kind of look below the surface and see what those assets and strengths are, because people live in this place. There's plenty of history potentially to investigate, and there are always issues that need to be dealt with. And I think a lot of this work really kind of originated in rural areas under the sponsorship of the Annenberg Rural Challenge back in the 1990s, which was the first national effort to really bring place-based education to a multiplicity of different districts around the country. And so my sense with place-based education is that a lot of it really just depends upon the creativity and energy of the teachers and their willingness to really reach out into the community to find out what those strengths are and which people and agencies are willing to partner with them. And oftentimes those agencies, have mandates that say that they're supposed to actually partner with communities around educational issues, or oftentimes are just really interested in reaching out to children at the school level in terms of accomplishing some of the work that they too need to be able to complete.
Yeah, and just to build on that, in terms of urban areas, we have students who we're working with in Detroit. Many of our teachers are in Detroit, and so next to one school is a brownfield, so they studied the brownfield and its impact. Next to another school, there were tires that had been illegally dumped there, so they studied industrial pollution and the supply chain and why tires get illegally dumped in some urban areas and in communities like theirs. And it raised this question of, why are tires being dumped in our community as opposed to the suburbs, which the teacher then had discussed with the young people. So oftentimes when you go into the store and you're recycling, not oftentimes, but sometimes the store says they're going to recycle your tires. Some of those folks then illegally dump them in communities like Southwest Detroit because it's cheaper to dump them there.
Yeah.
So it started this whole investigation into industrial pollution and also raised those ethical questions and civic questions there.
All right, so we're actually fortunate. We have a couple of episodes coming up in the future where we're going to talk to some teachers who are in the trenches, so to speak, doing place-based education, and we won't give that away just yet. But what about the teacher out there right now that says, hey, this is fantastic, I'd like to try that? How do they get started?
I think one of the things that Greg and I often talk about are that you start small. So some of the projects that we've mentioned have been very complex projects, and in our experience, it's kind of the rule of 3 years. You start small, you play around, you might fail the first time or encounter lots of barriers. The second time you do a project, you're tweaking it and you're building on it, and the third time maybe you feel like you've got something going. And the other piece of advice is that you can what Greg just mentioned around community partners is find a community partner and start to work with them and play with them around a problem that both of you are interested in. And a lot of our teachers, once they connect to a community partner, and that partnership is a good partnership, those partnerships build over the years. And so I think oftentimes we put our teachers under pressure. This is another word, as we're talking about words that we hate, I hate the word implement.
Oh God, I just used it yesterday.
We expect teachers to quote unquote implement a way of teaching in 1 year or something, but we know that this is a complicated way of teaching, right? And so we have to give our teachers permission, and we have to give them the professional development support to grow their practice over a period of years, and maybe each year they're adding on one more layer to their practice. So once you relieve that pressure, then the anxiety starts to go down because you're no longer under the pressure of having to do some amazing thing. It will be amazing, by the way. You'll be surprised what you can do in a short period of time. But I think the pressure often immobilizes teachers, and oftentimes, because we live in a very individualistic society, we think that we can pull ourselves up by the bootstraps, and there's this myth of the hero teacher who kind of goes it alone and does these amazing things. But the reality is, in place-based education, it's all about community and it's all about partnership. So the more partnerships, the more community you build. It does shift the role of the teacher, though. You now start to think of yourself as a community worker, not only the master of your subject content. You start to think of yourself as someone who necessarily has to build relationships in order to bring the knowledge and expertise and strengths into the classroom. And that is a shift.
The only thing that I'd like to add is just really encouraging teachers to find stuff that they're really interested in themselves and that they think that they can pull off without a huge amount of extra effort, and things that they're likely to be successful with. I was just reminded of a elementary school teacher that I visited in New Hampshire a few years ago, and she had moved to a new classroom, was kind of interested in trying to figure out something that she could return to over the course of the year as a kind of a theme, and looked out her window and saw this wonderful stand of eastern white pine. I thought, okay, I'm going to do kind of nature studies over the course of the year. And so she bought some kid-sized binoculars and second-grade appropriate field study guides and a digital camera that had a remote control device on it. And so the kids, over the course of the year, put out bird seeds so that they could kind of study the birds that happened to come. They tracked the animal tracks that they saw during the wintertime. They installed a device for kind of checking wind temperature and wind speed and air temperature. And when I visited in the spring, they built a kind of a brush pile in order to attract more birds closer to the classroom. And so all of this was pretty simple. But it really gave children an opportunity to kind of learn about the animals and plants in their own region, and so that they could kind of identify what they happened to see when they were walking to and from school and in their backyards. And so a real direct relevance to their own lives and a real applicability to their own experiences.
Sure. And I think it's so important to say that, this isn't, you don't have to go convert everything you do to this. This is, start small, and you're not going to be able to, and you can have a thread that can last and be part of that, just to get into it, basically.
And place-based education doesn't mean that you don't deal with regional, national, or international issues. Yeah. It really is a starting place and a way to build upon children's own direct experience of the world, as well as giving them an opportunity to make changes that are much more realistically likely to happen within the context of their own neighborhoods and communities. Mm-hmm. So it gives them, as Ethan was saying earlier, a sense of empowerment, because they really potentially can make a contribution. And I think all of us want to make that contribution, and place-based education opens the door for that for many children for whom those kinds of chances might not otherwise exist.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for introducing this to us, and we really look forward to talking more about it. Greg, Ethan, thanks very much.
Thank you, and glad we were able to have this conversation.
If you'd like to learn more about today's episode, head on over to our website, laboutloud.com, for more information. You can also find details about all the previous episodes, and you can leave us feedback and comments. We want to hear from you.
If you enjoyed the show, make sure you've subscribed on iTunes, Google Play Music, or your favorite podcasting platform. And if you really enjoyed it, consider leaving us a rating or a review. Your feedback helps others find our show.
If you like Lab Out Loud and you love the show that we provide for you, please consider supporting the show at our Patreon page. Head on over to patreon.com/laboutloud for more information. Until next time, I'm Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartel.